Hello, I'm Don Ward, Chief Executive of CIB, and this is another episode of CIB in Conversation. CIB, or Conseil International du Bâtiment in French, is the global network for collaboration in research and innovation in the built environment. And a big welcome to everyone joining us and watching this video today. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. For more information about what we do and how we add value for our global community, please see the website cibworld.org. So in this series, we meet the personalities behind leaders in the world of built environment research and innovation. And I'm delighted to say that my guest today is Dr. Paul Chan, Professor of Design and Construction Management at TU Delft, Netherlands. He's also Editor-in-Chief of Construction Management and Economics, one of the leading technical journals in our sector. And in fact, in that capacity, on our website, you'll see a recording of an excellent Meet the Editor webinar that Paul did back in May 2021. So Paul, hello.
Hello, Don. Good to see you.
It's great to see you, and thank you very much indeed for joining us again. I love your background, by the way. Very arty, very stylish.
That's a Frank Gehry building.
Impressed, right on message. So that's good for a professor of design management, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us in CIB in Conversation today. Let's start, if you would, by introducing yourself. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about your current roles and your involvement in the construction and built environment sector.
So as you explained, Don, in your introduction, I'm Professor of Design and Construction Management in the Faculty of Architecture in the Built Environment in TU Delft. My background really is construction management. And I do a lot of research that looks into the people side of delivering construction projects, and particularly focusing on how people deal with change. We are into a lot of disruptions at this moment, so change is the order of the day. And I'm very interested in how people kind of navigate through organizational change or even technological change that we are seeing today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I'll tell you what, before we get into that, and we will get into some of the detail around that work, let's hear a little bit more about your background. We like to hear about how our guests came into our industry and your early career. So how did you get started? What brought you into construction in the first place?
So I must say that I was born into construction, so to speak. My father was a contractor. He worked his way up from being a foreman, went to night classes, in the end setting up his own company, where I grew up in Singapore. He also worked overseas, so for 3 years I think he was working on building projects in Brunei. Maybe that's given me my kind of traveling bug also.
Yes.
But I must say that we were never really talk about construction. I mean, over the school vacation days, I used to help out in the office and so on. But it wasn't until I did my military service in Singapore. So we had to do our national service. And for 2.5 years, I was actually operating construction equipment. So bulldozers, excavators, JCBs, and mobile cranes. It was great fun. At that time, I thought this is something I want to really get into. So then I enrolled to read my undergraduate degree in Heriot-Watt University. So that was in construction management. And then the rest was history, as they say.
Well, we want to know a little bit more about this history. You don't get away with it that early, Paul. But you know, there's not too many academics, I suggest, who would have started on the tools. Did you bring any learning to bear in your future career? I've heard you talk about people there. You know, maybe there's something at some angle that you picked up right in your early days from site.
Yeah, I must say that I'm not sure whether I'm really practical on the tools. It was just great fun. When you're 18 years old on those huge machines, you know, it's very exciting. And of course, when you're operating these huge machines, you often have to pay attention to the workers around you. So I was already very exposed to the fact that you have to really collaborate with your co-workers. At the same time, I think growing up in Singapore, I think everybody knows that in Singapore, the construction sector is, you know, there's a lot of migrant workers. And so I also became really quite interested in, you know, how they work, the skills levels. So skills was something that I was very interested in. And although it was a really practical experience operating on these machines, you also had to learn the kind of technical side of things. So I remember even in the military service, we had to learn about soil mechanics. Alongside operating the machines, we also had to do the mathematical calculations to understand soil behavior. And that I think was quite interesting. So it was actually not just about the practical tools, but also understanding the theory behind it.
Well, so you were obviously born, as you said, to this, but it sounds like you took to it like I don't know, like a duck to water. There's probably a construction simile I could think of there, but time doesn't allow me to. So there you were doing your degree. I can see what motivated you to do that. I guess at the end of that degree, you had a choice of going into the industry, going back to the industry, as it were, or going on to do a PhD. What were the factors that you took into account, and what choice did you make?
Yes, indeed. I think I had the choice to go to industry. I remember also getting a nice award from Balfour Beatty when I was an undergraduate student. And then I applied to actually work for them. But during my final year in the undergraduate course, I did a dissertation. And the dissertation was really looking at the issue of skills. And a lot of people, when they study skills, they tend to look at the supply side. So how do we train people? But I was very interested in actually the demand side. I mean, this was in the 1999, 2000. So this was even before the kind of employer-led, demand-led training came into force. So I was very interested in training participation. So not just about training provision, but what do employers see as the value of actually skills development. And then I really enjoyed doing research. So with my undergraduate dissertation supervisor at the time, we decided to develop that further to say, well, can we encourage more training participation if we tied that to the question of productivity? Right. So my PhD was then looking at productivity. And initially, I wanted to do a really quantitative analysis of whether if you invested £1 in training, you could get £1.20 back in productivity. This was my kind of very naive initiation into the PhD process. And then I realized that life was very much more complex than that companies really never got a handle in terms of measuring productivity. Yes. Or even if they did, you also had to be quite cautious about what the data was telling you. At that time, I started to pay attention to the conversations on site and in the offices. And then I realized that managers and workers were thinking about productivity in very different ways. So at the end, my PhD was really to look at the differences in the ways workers and managers viewed the concept of productivity. Yeah, so that was interesting moment, I think, also for me to realize that the people side really matters.
Right, right. So I can see, well, yes, we can see how your career started to take shape from that motivation. Did you have a particular key finding from your PhD?
I think there were several findings. I think at that time also there was a lot of interest in worker participation and worker involvement. And very often when we think about planning projects, we often kind of think about the planners. And at that time also there was this debate, I think it's still ongoing, that you cannot plan a project just by sitting in the office and in front of a computer, that you needed to really involve the workers' knowledge because they often know how to fabricate, how to assemble things, put things together. And so I think it's really important that we do not lose that kind of the knowledge from the workers. So I think that was maybe the key takeaway message.
And you've mentioned the word of collaboration already, and I think what comes across for me there is collaboration with the workforce, as it were, is as important as perhaps collaboration with other members of the supply chain or with other disciplines, and perhaps it's an aspect which has been overlooked by some in the past. So there you are, finishing your PhD Paul, and with some expertise in, may I say, in productivity and in worker skills development and worker involvement. What did you do next?
So interestingly enough, I applied for a job, I remember, at a steelworks plant. Yeah, it was
See that coming, yes.
Yeah, it was in Wales, I remember. I think that plant was in the end owned for a while by Tata Steel. But anyway, so I applied for that, and part of that interview process, they actually had an academic, I think Professor Keith Alexander, who was from Salford. And at that time, after the interview, he said to me that they were also employing postdoctoral researchers. So when the job opening was advertised, I applied, and then I moved into academic research. So it was, I won't say by accident, but it was fortuitous that I met Keith at that interview. So I was also prepared to move to industry, and then returned back to academia almost immediately.
Yes. So, and what tipped the balance?
I think it was this. I'm always very curious. I think when I was in school, my school teacher used to say that I'm a daydreamer, and I think in academic research, I think there is a certain degree of curiosity, I guess. And this was really a great opportunity because normally a postdoc researcher is employed to deliver very strict deliverables of a project. But in this particular job scope, you could also have a lot of initiative to shape what those research projects look like. And I was working with very interesting, very, I think, very helpful mentors. So my line manager at that time was Professor Rachel Cooper, and she's a professor of design management. She's moved on since to Lancaster University now. But I learned so much from her in those years of doing my postdoc with her. But it also allows me to kind of really develop the ideas for my PhD. And that was when I really started looking at skills, not just between workers and managers, but now across the kind of supply chain also.
Cool. And what would you describe as a highlight from that time, from your time as a postdoc doc researcher?
Yeah. So during the PhD years, you often feel like you were very isolated. So you're always working alone, trying to produce your thesis and, of course, the publications that come along with that. And it was really the first time I was exposed to a research group, and that you felt that you were not alone, that you had different expertise, different points of view, different levels of interest, and that everything coming together in a kind of research group was, for me, really quite exciting. So at that time, I was working with my contemporary, who is now Professor Patricia Georgopoulos.
Oh yes.
So
yeah.
she was also in Rachel Cooper's group, and we were looking at actually the primary healthcare facilities in the UK, trying to figure out how people were dealing with this change in procurement arrangements, and then how to navigate through the complexity of working with stakeholders that you are not familiar with. We then published a paper on looking at the fuzzy front end of projects and what should clients pay attention to in terms of managing that part of the process. So of course, Patricia came with the kind of design management angle, and I came in from the kind of organizational and human resource angle, and that was quite exciting.
And another example of collaboration, Paul, in your career, that seems to me. But Patricia's a CIB board member, of course, these days. At what point in your career did you first come into contact with CIB?
Yeah, it was during my postdoc years. So I used to present papers at CIB conferences, and what I really valued in those conferences is to meet colleagues in across the world. They were colleagues who were from academia, but also from industry. So that was exciting. Around that time, I also worked with Rachel on a book called Constructing Futures. We were very interested in figuring out how all the CEOs in construction were thinking about the future. So we interviewed them, but rather than to just focus on the forecasting part of futures thinking, we were also very interested to figure out how their life stories shape their thinking about the future. So it became a book. Actually, it was a hobby where we
Yeah.
interviewed 15 people and just asked them about their childhood and their growing up, you know, the personalities, as you were saying,
Yeah.
and trying to figure out how that conditioned the way they thought about the future. And at that time, I wrote a paper which was presented in a CIB conference around leadership. And then somebody was in the audience. This somebody was Professor Christine Räisänen from Chalmers University in Sweden. And she really liked what I was saying. And in the end, invited me to give a talk in Sweden. And then I've been doing that for 13, 14 years, maybe even longer now. I even supported one of the courses for quite a while. So I think I really value, again, the opportunities that CIB opened up to kind of meet colleagues from around the world. Yeah.
Wonderful to hear, music to my ears in terms of the value of this global network, you know. And it might be that, or it might be something else. So, you know, we have lots of early career researchers and students, PhD students, that watch these episodes. Do you have any tips or advice specifically for an early career researcher or someone who's doing a PhD thinking about maybe postdoctoral research?
Yeah, so I think in relation to, let's say, CIB, I would say do not just go to the conferences just to present your work. Presenting your work is important, but actually listening to the conversations and kind of networking with people, trying to figure out what other people think, I think is also really quite important. Sometimes I think particularly PhDs are so keen to get their pitch perfect presentation. And they spend an awful lot of time trying to, and a lot of nerves also, trying to deliver the best presentation. But actually, it's the networking that I think is really important.
That's a fantastic tip, Paul. Thank you very much. I don't think anyone's put it quite like that in my hearing in recent times. Anyway, um, and then you moved from Salford. You got involved with Sweden, and then I think you went to Northumbria and then Manchester. Is that right? I first met you when you were at Manchester. I do remember that.
Yes.
So how did your moves come about?
Well, so I was doing this postdoc research and it was really exciting. I was working with a number of companies at the time and they were very progressive. But in the end, I thought, what are we producing? And there was a lot of drive towards producing publications. And I was also wondering, what were the usefulness of these publications? And then another thing also was, are we actually driving change? And I think with our collaborators, we were. But the question was, how do we scale up that change across the sector? And then I thought actually teaching was one of the ways in which you could influence the next generation of practitioners. And then the job came up in Northumbria. My brother at the time also got a place in Northumbria to read his bachelor's degree in psychology. So everything seemed to line up. And I applied for the job in Northumbria, got it. And those were 4 years of very formative years of my career as a teacher.
Right.
Because not only was I teaching full-time students, but I was also teaching part-time students. So these were very seasoned practitioners. And sometimes I often wonder, what do they get out of a lesson with me, right?
Mhm.
And then it struck me that a lot of them are really, they've learned through the hard knocks of life. And, they have all this very valuable experience, but they just maybe don't have the vocabulary to express that. And sometimes when they go to classes and they hear about the theories, they realize, aha, this is actually what I've been going through all this while. And I think that is also a value to give them the kind of the language to kind of communicate with one another as well. So yeah, those were 4 years. And during that time, I was also running research projects. One which stands out in particular was a project on knowledge leakage. We were very interested in how people share knowledge and what were the consequences for that. And that was also the time when I had a case study in mental health hospital design. And again, how do we work across different disciplines, not just within the built environment, but also, let's say, with clinicians, with mental health workers, with also the artists. At that time, there was a strong movement, I think still today, on using the environment to stimulate healing. So how do we use art, for example, to really drive better healing outcomes? So those were really interesting times when you started to step outside of your comfort zone to figure out how you can learn from one another to produce better outcomes.
And so on to Manchester.
Yeah, so that was another interesting move because at that time I also got a research grant that was going to be working with Manchester Airport. So as a result of that, indeed, there was a position that opened up in the University of Manchester. And that was a very interesting project also because it was looking at how we can make airport operations more sustainable,
Right.
which sounds like an irony,
Yes.
of course. But I think they were really keen on this idea of, we've got a sustainability policy, but what does that mean for our daily operations? So again, that gave me a very different context. Again, the fundamental question I always ask is, how do people deal with that change? And it was very interesting because instinctively, we often think that resistance to change is always a problem. But what I found was that resistance is really quite necessary. If
Right.
you don't resist, you don't learn. So I think resistance is really part and parcel of learning to change. So again, that gave me insights into a completely different environment. I mean, I was always a plane spotter when I was growing up. My mother was used to work in an airline, so I have always been very fascinated by aircraft. So this was a dream project for me, I guess.
Excellent, excellent. I love that sort of personal touch. That's good. And then, Paul, I mean, at the time, I seem to remember at Manchester when I first met you, you were teaching a course, a huge course by Manchester standards anyway, 300 people, was it, on a project management MSc? Have I
Yeah,
remembered that correctly?
and
Yeah.
when I left, it was 421. Yeah.
Does that, what sorts of challenges does that bring?
So well, also the setup of the curriculum is very different. There's a lot of, Manchester is quite a traditional university, so they also still have very traditional 2 or 3 hour long lectures. But that's pretty much what we did. And so engaging with students was always an issue because how do you then scale up seminar groups? So we tended to use a lot of online engagement, which of course nowadays would be really helpful
Yes,
given the
yes.
global pandemic. But we also had, not only were we teaching these large master's courses, we also had the professionals. So we had professional engineers who were what we will call the accidental project managers. So they trained as a mechanical engineer or, aerospace engineer, and then they would work for companies like Rolls-Royce or, another type of company, and as an engineer, and then accidentally fall into the role of being a project manager. So again, they needed to kind of, they need to move horizontally then to learn new skills. And so we taught project management also to these professional engineers. So that was very interesting. And we also set up a sort of program in Singapore. So again, we also had this blended learning where we would do some sort of keynote lectures and seminars in Singapore. But then the rest of the engagement is through the online medium. So yeah, it's just exposed me to different forms of student engagement, I guess. The cohorts are also very different. So the full-time cohort was largely international students. So again, they brought in very different experiences and perspectives to the British one, I guess.
And I guess that's an important part of the learning of the quality of the cohort and the different experiences that the students are bringing to the discussion themselves.
Yeah, indeed. And it also challenges your prior assumptions of what, we often have assumptions as to what should work and what shouldn't work. And then you suddenly get confronted by very different examples, and it kind of challenges your way of thinking, I guess, So very often I'm left wondering, if it works well in that context, why does it work? Why doesn't that work in the British context, let's say? And that's been carrying through in my life, I must say, because over the last 2 years, I've also moved to the Netherlands. So even though the Netherlands is in Europe and it's rather close to the UK, there are also significant differences in the way people deal with things, I guess. Yeah.
So, I mean, that seems to be that's a brave move to move to a country, especially where you're going to have to teach in a new language, teaching in Dutch, not in English. Well, what other challenges or differences have you noticed in, what's different in academic life in the Netherlands compared with the UK?
I would say, and I say this to my friends also, moving to the Netherlands was like learning how to walk again. Because indeed we walk on the different side of the road. So for a while I was always bumping into people in the Netherlands, and then I got so used to the Dutch way, and then when I go back to the UK, I'm bumping into people on the other side. So I think that's really interesting. Fortunately, I haven't really had much sort of scope to teach the bachelor's program yet. I do a bit of student tutoring, but indeed our bachelor's program is taught in Dutch. And then the master's cohort is taught in English. So that's also where I do a lot of my teaching.
Right.
What I would say is that it's very collaborative in the Netherlands. So many courses, in fact, virtually all courses are taught by a team of teachers who bring different perspectives to the table. So I think that's really interesting. Yeah, this is also the first time I have moved to the Faculty of Architecture. And as you may probably know, that the architects are often educated in a slightly different way. So the studio type teaching is still very much, it runs through the core of architectural education. So I'm learning new things also because there is a very strong design element. So even in the research dissertations that our students do, they often do it with a company. So again, I find that the engagement with industry is really very, very close. And very often it is the industry people, the practitioners themselves, who are reading the papers and who are often rather critical about what they read also. So I think that was a really quite an eye-opening experience for me, because it also means that I have to really be mindful of the assumptions that I'm making, the concepts that I'm talking about. So there's a lot of collaboration with practitioners, but also across different disciplines.
Interesting. And you referred there, Paul, to the architectural model of teaching, based around the studio. I recall a discussion in CIB recently about the equivalent, where's the new model, new thinking around the equivalent for, say, construction management? Do you have any thoughts on that subject?
This is, I think it has been a long-standing debate, and often people also talk about the medical profession, for example, that, are we delivering book knowledge, or should we also have, some sort of practical knowledge also injected into the curriculum? I think that's where placements, internships still play a very useful part. The architectural studios are also, they tend to be led by practicing architects also.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. I think it's good for practitioners too, because then it gives them some time out of practice to come back and reflect and think. And, I think it actually works both ways. I think there's a lot documented already about the benefits for students, but actually I think for the practitioners, is incredibly valuable because they get to really start to think about their positions and perspectives also.
I think you make some great points, Paul, and we've had one or two conversations around similar themes in the past, I know. And, you know, I see CIB as pretty perfectly positioned in this nexus of academia with industry and with governments, but particularly acting as this bridge between academia and industry. And how do we facilitate greater collaboration and therefore greater value for both communities? And you're pointing at a number of, you know, potential ways in which we learn from, in this case, the Netherlands, but and other professions.
So we are editing a book at this moment called Interventionist Research Methods. And this was really inspired by my own reflection of the 2 years I've been in the Netherlands. What I find in our students is that it is not enough just to analyze the problem, just to figure out what the scientific evidence is. That is really important because often practitioners may not have the time to really chew into the scientific evidence. So having a good, strong analytical mind is quite important. But actually, a lot of our students also want to make the next leap, which is how do I move from analysis to actually designing something that could work? And I think that actually, if you think about even scientific research, the whole purpose of science, I think, is to constantly think and to rethink our propositions and our concepts. And part of that rethinking is always to figure out, does it work or not, or does it not work? So I'm really quite inspired by my students who actually want to make the leap, to move beyond just analyzing to actually designing, you know, either a process, a solution, an artifact. And I think that that's something that I have learned over the last 2 years, the value of this sort of design education.
And you've talked there about your one of your latest projects on the teaching side, as it were. What's your latest research project that you think CIB members might be interested in?
So funny enough, I'm leading a project now funded by the Dutch funding agency, and the title of the project is called Stepping Out. And the idea is, how do professionals step outside of their comfort zone when they have to deal with other disciplines, when they have to deal with non-professionals? So nowadays we are also seeing a lot more citizen engagement in developing schemes and projects. So how do they step outside of their comfort zone when they have to deal with the many transitions that we have to deal with? So for example, we have the energy transition, there's the net zero challenge, but there's also the energy transition where we are beginning to kind of diversify our portfolio to go into more renewables, less dependency on fossil fuels and gas. There is the circularity transition. So how do we make sure that we do not just take, make, and then throw away, but actually make sure that we close the loops in the material loops? There's so many other transitions, the water transition, the climate change adaptation transition, the housing transition. I think housing transition affects virtually everyone, I think, around the planet. How can young people afford to buy their houses, or, you know, to pay for the houses that they live in? And then how do we design those houses? I think there's also the population transition, which means that our housing needs, our office needs, I think there are new ways of living, there are new ways of working, there's new ways of traveling. And these new ways would create sort of the drive to rethink our prior assumptions of what works and what doesn't work. So for 5 years, we are going to be looking at exactly in these urban development projects, how do we actually encourage people to step outside and learn from one another when they have to deal with these transitions?
Well, your theme, which started right from before your degree around people and change has obviously continued through to the current day, and no doubt well into the future, Paul. I hope we'll hear more about it at CIB conferences and in CIB journals in the future. Well, that's the point. We haven't talked about your journal. I know we did a separate webinar in which you talked about your role as editor and gave a huge amount of valuable information to potential authors and reviewers of papers and so on and so forth. But why don't you give us a minute on the joys of being an editor of a major technical journal?
Okay, so it is indeed very useful for me to keep up to date with what's happening in the field of research. So being an editor, you tend to get to see these manuscripts with all the cutting edge research. Construction management and economics really specializes on studies, publishing research that deals with management and economic aspects in the production of the built environment. And I say that because it's not just about the construction projects. For a long time, I think we always think construction is about the project. But actually, increasingly, I think construction people are required to think the long term. We need to think about the built assets that we manage. We need to shift away from just producing the product to thinking about the service. There are huge challenges and huge opportunities with digital transformation, with industrialization. There are maybe new business models, etc. So it's really exciting times right now to really think about how is it going to change the ways we manage, but also the ways in which we figure out the economics of construction. I think this is also very important. So if anyone is interested in contributing to the journal, I would definitely welcome a conversation.
Excellent, thank you very much. And you're very accessible as an editor, I can confirm that. So I hope people will be suitably inspired and encouraged to connect with you. Paul, before we finish, I've got two more sort of quick themes to talk about. The penultimate one is really the impact of the global pandemic. You know, as we talk, it's the best part of 18 months since everybody's life was dramatically impacted, and that includes impacts on the sector, both in terms of how we can do our projects, but also what we build. And do you have any reflections, maybe on the research side or on the teaching side, of what those impacts have been, where the biggest impacts, and perhaps more of interest, you know, what they might still be to come? Where do we think we might see change in the needs of the built environment, or any major implications for the profession or for the curriculum?
I think there are immense opportunities, and maybe we should do a complete webinar on this, and we can have a panel discussion.
We probably should, and now you say it, we will. So
yeah.
Yes, so,
I think that
I
think there are several directions this could take. For sure, I think the disruption has then raised questions around the performance of the sector. So clearly, we have to deliver the projects that are already commissioned. So I think there has been quite a lot of interest in trying to figure out how can we retain that kind of performance, right, that we had before. But I think beyond that, I think we have started to raise the very inconvenient questions, to use the phrase from Al Gore, because I think indeed these are inconvenient questions. Maybe the pandemic was also a result of our overdevelopment in the world. So actually, maybe construction itself also contributed to the pandemic. And I think we are starting to figure out, okay, what does growth look like? And is it, you know, should we also be caring about the environment? We are having interesting conversations about, you know, what's the future of offices? You know, what are the future of houses? Because of course we have been locked down quite a long time, and then people are suffering from mental health. So I think this is a really good moment where we start to bring competing values on the table, and we discuss them, and we start to say, okay, where are the trade-offs and what's the future like? I think that there are also very interesting questions around the issue of resilience. How resilient are our financial markets? You know, that's also tied to our real estate market. And then the question, of course, is do we bounce back to the old normal, or do we bounce forward to a better future? And I think in the UK, there is this building back better rhetoric. I think that's maybe something that's across the world. And I think in the future, we have suddenly been thrown into this digital space. So working from home used to be a luxury made by choice. And now we are sort of forced to work from home. But I think that we are going to start seeing a lot more interactions through this medium, online, through video calls. But at the same time, we are also having questions around, okay, what does social contact look like in the future? And perhaps what is the role of the built environment in trying to help us maintain that type of contact? So I think this is a great moment to start thinking about very exciting questions for a better future.
That's a very inspiring message, I think, Paul, for the viewers, for the members of CIB, and frankly anyone in the research and construction sectors. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I could talk to you for hours. You're really powerful communicator, and also very, you've obviously done a lot of it, and you're very reflective in the way you speak. It's impressive to hear from you. So I'm sure everybody has enjoyed listening to you, despite the poor promptings from myself. I've got one final question that we ask everybody, and that is what we call the top opportunity, and this is thinking about politicians and policymakers around the world. From your field of expertise, coming from any perspective really in any respect that we've talked about, what would you say is the top opportunity or challenge that politicians and policymakers around the world need to be thinking about in regards to our sector?
I think this is tied also to the pandemic. The pandemic allowed us to realize that all our prior assumptions can be thrown out of the window. We realize also that, why should we have 2-hour meetings when we can do it in 5 minutes, right? Yeah. So I think that the top opportunity is that we should always start to find ways of doing things differently if we actually want to drive change.
Well, that's a lovely soundbite and a very nice way on which to finish our conversation, Paul. As I said, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your effort and your wider support for CIB. You're a terrific advocate and supporter, and a person who's engaged with what we do. I'm absolutely certain that everybody will have enjoyed hearing from you. To our audience, for more information on this event or Paul's work, or on details of it, you can find Paul easily on the website, but you can find details on our website as well. So please get in touch also with any feedback or any suggestions for future guests that people would like to hear from. I'm open anytime to contacts about how we can improve what CIB is doing. So with a massive thank you to you, Paul. Thank you. That's it for this edition of CIB in Conversation. I'm Don Ward. And Paul Chan, thank you very much indeed, and goodbye from CIB until our next episode. Thank you.